See, here we are. And after the sovereign debt crisis, it became a social crisis. We've had the Greek and Spanish social unrest, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, student movements in Britain, France, Canada, the Russian protests in countries that are Russia, not a country where poverty is the problem, but unfreedom. By 2011, the crisis has now worked its way through into the political fabric of the USA. It pitched the liberal and the conservative wings of America into this high-stakes game of chicken over the deficit. They're playing it again tonight, even as we speak. Will they allow themselves to close down large parts of their public administration? This crisis is working its way through almost everything. And the Nomura economist, Richard Koo, describes it as a balance sheet recession. Now what this means is that the scale of the debt that we are left with, the toxic debt and the unpayable debt that we are left with in the public sector, in the private sector, among companies and among consumers, is so great that if you add up the value of everything they own and compare it to what they owe, the balance is negative. And as everybody tries to pay down their debt, this sucks demand from the economy, even if the policymakers try and stimulate demand. And problem is, of course, nobody is yet prepared to write off the debt. Write off the debts of householders, of banks, of countries. Some are, but largely you don't, because if you write off somebody's debt, somebody else takes the other side of that. Your pension fund largely is exposed to all three of those kind of debts. Nobody is yet prepared to unleash inflation at such a scale that would then shrink the debts to size. Remember, because of course if you have high inflation, those of you in this room, and there are some of them like me who remember a period of high inflation, it will wipe out very quickly people's savings in their bank accounts and their pensions, unless they are linked to inflation. And at the same time, no Western economy is yet capable of growing its way out rapidly of the debt, but no Western economy is yet prepared to unleash the kind of trade and currency rivalry against everybody else in a bid to capture what growth there is. I would argue there's maybe an exception to that, which we'll come to. But in general, nobody is yet prepared to do the kind of hard things that bring the entire period to a close. Now you will have noticed the biggest word on this slide I'm showing at the moment is the word yet. Because I think the moment that countries or policymakers or classes or segments of the population, young versus old, decide to play hardball over some of this stuff, then this very nice sounding thing, the balance sheet recession, which kind of lulled us into a sense of, well, balance sheet recession doesn't sound as bad as a slump or a crisis. The balance sheet recession can't go on forever. The exit routes from it historically are the things that are up there behind me, and at some point somebody is going to decide to do it. Why? Because every policymaker has read Ben Bernanke's book, the boss of the US Federal Reserve. When he was a prof, he reminded us in his history of the Great Depression of the 30s that those who cut and run first from the international monetary system, then called the gold standard, the people who came off gold first, recovered first, says Bernanke. In the back rooms of the policy elite, the word financial repression is very prevalent. There's a famous paper called Financial Repression by Reinhardt and Sbranica, two US academics, who describe how the West was able to engineer the post-1945 boom alongside rapid growth, alongside the rapid shrinkage of the debt pile. How they used high inflation and they forced savings to be captured within national boundaries. You couldn't say, I don't like the interest rate in Britain, I'm going to invest in Germany. You had to keep your money there. You had to keep your money invested in the bonds of your own country. And you couldn't even, those of you again my age, might remember this, I do remember it, you couldn't take money out of the country. 50 quid, was it? Yeah. You could take out. On holiday, no more. And they checked as well, okay? You sneakily came through customs with more than 50 quid. They could tell it just as the same as they can spot the drug mules today. So what this means is that $6 trillion dollars worth of printed money they've printed, and many more trillions in sovereign debts held by the countries whose combined public and private debt runs into many times GDP. All this means that logic, and to me history, dictates that sooner or later somebody is going to head for that exit route. And if they start doing it, it ain't going to be pretty. You might ask, well, how would you get in an extremely depressed global economy the kind of high inflation that we had in the early 70s, or in the early in America in the late 40s, early 50s? How would you get high inflation? When we brainstormed this, me and my colleagues, one obvious way is obviously you just have a war with Iran, because that's going to close the Straits of Hormuz, and then you get 15% inflation. You only need it for 2 or 3 years, because then it averages out, it compounds out. Reinhardt and Spranica, financial repression, bedtime reading for the people who run our economy. But to understand what happens if this happens, or even if it doesn't happen, what happens, what kind of world is the economy emerging into as it struggles finally to take the last step out of the crisis that began in 2007, 2008, we have to look at the long term. And that's why Kondratiev is important. Right. Now this is how he did it. Highly controversial. Even my colleague here, Mike, doesn't like Kondratiev for this. But he goes, okay, there's UK foreign trade over 100 years, 1820 to 1910. And he says, he tries to discover a trend line, that's the dotted line, and then the real data is that black line that is jagged and moves around. And even some of you might even be able to spot it even now. And if I had one of those red pointy things, I could point it out to you. There's a very clear wave pattern there. But what he does is he smooths it out, and he then plots the deviations from the trend. That is, he plots the deviations from the dotted line. And when he does that, that's what you get. And in the shaded bit, which I'm sorry about the colours, that's all my Mac will run to, you can see in that shaded bit, there's something quite like that. If you're a nurse and you look after heart patients, you can see what it is. It's a wave, okay? That's why he calls it, or why his followers called it, the long wave. Because that wave lasts about 50 years, and there's an up bit and a down bit. Now, a lot of other rubbish is talked by people about Kondratiev and what he discovered. But really, all he discovered was that in the data, that there is something going on in the sort that means that for about 20 or 25 years, capitalism expands, and the expansionary periods are more common than the contractions. And then for about 20 to 25 years, it does the opposite. This is something that before Kondratiev, people had suspected, but he was the first one to really try and demonstrate it with data. Of course, those of you who are academics, and maybe even hopefully people who study this here, I would love to hear from you in the Q&A, will know that it's all heavily contested. I'm putting it to you without caveat, because I want to explain to you rather than to go into the deep detail. So in these two works of I think quite brilliant analysis in the 1920s, he showed that 50-year cycles exhibit a common pattern, this upsurge and a downtrend.